Hey guys, all right, this is going to be a quick-ish video where I'm just going to go over the process that I'm using at the moment for creating, just sort of like quick Instagram sort of images, or when I just kind of want to do a quick character design or something like that. A couple of people have kind of asked, like what am I doing sort of currently, and if it's similar to the sort of processes and techniques that I've used in the past for comics, or sort of other illustrations. So the answer is essentially yes. I'm sort of still using a very similar sort of process, which I'll sort of show you. I'm just going to go over it quickly with these images just to show you sort of what's happening in the layers and just the differences and similarities between what I'm doing now or what I was doing previously. And then once I've sort of gotten that out of the way, we will jump into an actual sort of recorded tutorial, and I'll kind of talk you guys through the process. So yeah, again, this is sort of an example of sort of what I'm doing sort of recently. Again, sort of mid 2017, and again, the process is very simple. It's basically create a line drawing, and that can be a process of creating a detailed, comprehensive sketch beforehand, and then doing finish lines. Or sometimes if I'm feeling, if I've done a lot of drawing that day, sometimes I can just kind of like jump into it, and do almost sort of start sort of with ink, with a very rough sketch, which is sort of what we'll do with the actual demo. But however we do it, whether I create it in Photoshop or whatever, it could be sort of anywhere. This, for instance, is something that was a scan. So we're sort of looking at, this is sort of the scanned line work, done with a 0.5 mechanical pencil on a fairly big bit of paper actually. So yeah, and again, the process is very similar here to what I've been doing, for a long time. Essentially what I would do is I take, sort of got simple background here, but again, this process can be the same, it's the same as if I'm doing a big illustration or something. It just ends up with more layers and more stuff. So take a line drawing. I'm going to create sort of flat colors underneath that, and then I'm going to sort of link sort of colors on top of that sort of base sort of flat layer, and sort of create the flats. And you can do this all on one layer, all on separate. Sometimes it's quicker to do it on sort of separate layers. Sometimes just do it on one. So basically create a flat animated sort of toon style version of the coloring, and then over the top of that, often with a hard light layer or something, I'm going to go over sort of fairly softly and just sort of push a bit of rendering. But again, it's important to understand not a lot of with this particular sort of image, I'm still trying to keep a fairly sort of cartoony look to things, so I'm not going into rendering. Again, if people want me to sort of go into depth with some of those sort of theories and reasons why I'm sort of doing some of those things, just let me know. I can go over some of that other stuff in detail. But yeah, a lot of these choices, in terms of sort of putting texture over the top, how much I'm rendering, also, the fact that often when I'm doing this flatting, I'm actually sort of, one of the changes that I have made is I've started to actually use this sort of pencil brush, and a pencil is different to the Photoshop brush in that it doesn't sort of have anti-aliasing. A brush is going to do some sort of very different stuff. It's going to create sort of soft edges, whereas this is a pencil. So you always know, like, no matter what you sort of do with the pencil, no matter what brush we sort of pick, it's always going to be sort of very sort of bitmap, right? And that just means we don't have any anti-aliasing. Whereas if I was to use a brush, right, and get those smooth edges. Whereas if I use pencil tool, right, it gives me these sharp edges. And again, it's a slightly more graphic quality to it. I do it because it kind of stops me from getting smudgy, right? From getting too sort of into the gray zone, right? Keeps things sort of graphic. Some of this rendering is done with the brush though, so that's a little bit more subtle. So it's sort of layering subtlety and not subtlety. And again, the choice of kind of trying to leave stuff a little bit sketchy, again, is sort of on purpose, because, you know, that's sort of the mix of how much time I need to spend on something, you know, the sort of the quality of what I sort of want out of it. Again, it's a sketchy line drawing. I feel like, you know, you kind of marrying a sketchy sort of color treatment with a sketchy line drawing kind of works to give a certain effect, right? So again, these are sort of choices. You know, if I want it to be cleaner, it'll be cleaner. But in this case, those are sort of things that I'm doing specifically to get that sort of result. So again, I'll kind of layer up some, you know, various sort of like color adjustments or sort of some more subtle gradients, right? So it's starting with something very simple and graphic, and then I kind of just tweak it and push it and pull it. But again, often some of the adjustments I make are kind of to pull contrast from it. Do you know what I mean? Because I don't necessarily want it to be sort of super punchy. I want it to have a, you know, somewhat sort of aged mood to it. So again, a lot of these things are sort of conscious choices, but I always start with that basic sort of cell shaded look. And then, you know, I kind of play around with color adjustments at the end, basically to kind of push and pull things. Yeah, and that's pretty much the same process, you know, that I sort of used on this. The difference here being that the lines were kind of created with Photoshop as opposed to sort of scanned. And, you know, here's another one, again, sort of very similar sort of process. If I can figure out what lines are where and what is exactly happening. Right, so we've got the lines, and then I'm sort of just starting to put in, right, some sort of very basic, and I think this one is actually done. I'm really trying to focus on just using that brush, right? Like not using any sort of, using that pencil, right? Not using any sort of brush or anything that will allow me to get too sort of fancy with it. Just because it's sort of, it's more of a mental exercise than anything. Yeah, so that's the basic process. Again, it's very similar to processes that you know, I was sort of using, you know, back in sort of 2000, you know, 7, you know, where I was sort of, you know, trying to create, you know, digital art, just purely in Photoshop with a comic book sort of style, which again is, I found was sort of fairly rare back then. There wasn't many people doing a lot of line work in Photoshop, you know, in sort of 2000, you know, sort of 6, 7, 8, because Photoshop just wasn't very good, you know, at doing lines. You know, you couldn't rotate the canvas and do all that kind of stuff. Painter could, but Painter is not really robust enough to sort of create, you know, professional comic book work. I didn't find anyway. It just couldn't handle the layers and resolution and stuff. And again, it's very similar to the sort of process I was using, you know, back in, you know, 2004, 2003, where I just kind of, you know, scan a line drawing, put color behind it, right? Very, very sort of simple. Again, this one's pretty rough, but, you know, there'll be differences, right? But the differences are mostly, you know, technical. It's like, how much speed can I have? How much resolution can I have? What's possible? What's easy? You know, back in the day, for instance, I think, you know, we would sort of do this sort of thing where, you know, instead of just putting the lines, you know, like, you know, on a layer, you know, scan them, we would sort of do this kind of thing where, you know, you'd actually put the lines as a mask on a black layer, because that's quicker sort of for Photoshop. It takes up less file space because this is, you know, an 8-bit. It's kind of like where people, you know, put the lines in channels and stuff like that. That's kind of what you had to do, you know, because computing power was a very sort of scarce resource, and little things like that would kind of speed it up a little bit. So apart from that kind of thing, it's all very sort of similar to what I've been doing for a long time. It's just sort of, you know, the drawing is maybe a little bit better, hopefully. And again, you know, it's a little bit easier to kind of add texture and play around with that stuff, and add, you know, 10 trillion color adjustments, so I can just sit back and sort of fiddle with things ad nauseum. Whereas again, you know, that would kind of start to really slow things down, you know, 10 years ago. So that's really the basis for this process. What I'll do now is we'll sort of jump into a pre-recorded, you know, version of me sort of, you know, going through this process from start to finish, so, you know, you can see exactly what I'm doing. Okay, so I have a pre-set up file, which I kind of, have things like sort of signatures and sort of, line adjustment layers and, sort of standard stuff. And it's a square, so I know this will sort of fit something like Instagram, which again, I quite like that sort of, format and ratio anyway. So, I have these set up. So to save a bit of time, and what I'm doing here is just a very sort of simple, rough sort of sketch, and just sort of playing around with sort of basic pose, getting the idea down. A lot of the time this sort of depends, how good I'm sort of feeling. I think this image was a bit sort of I wasn't really sort of warmed up drawing wise that day, so this probably takes a little bit longer than some other sort of images. In terms of figuring out the line work and stuff. So, but just sort of, get a rough idea, and now I'm just going to sort of start to draw, right? Again, this sort of process is not necessarily how one should do it. This is kind of often when I do these sort of images, I'm sort of trying to challenge myself. I'm trying to sort of draw and do a lot of thinking, not sort of necessarily trying to pick a reliable process. I'm trying to sort of pick an interesting process, because that's kind of one of the reasons I would do, a daily sketch or, a weekly sketch or something is to sort of, for it to be a bit more of a challenge. If this was something for, a client or something, purposeful, something that I needed to be a certain way, obviously there'd be a lot more pre-drawing and, like a much better sort of design construction drawing. And again, I've picked a very sort of simple sort of demo pose and that sort of thing. So again, this process is based around that concept, right? And really, I find the key with doing this sort of more direct drawing, where I'm not kind of, doing a big construction drawing underneath. It's really a matter of sort of knowing, where the problem areas are going to be, and just making sure those kind of things are solved sort of early on. So for instance, the way the head connects to the torso is very important. And I think you can see I'll move that around a little bit. But there's a couple of sort of key landmarks that are sort of fairly important. And I'd say, it's sort of how the head and neck connect to the torso is very critical. And just getting all of those basic proportions down is important. And once you kind of lock in a couple of them, the rest of the drawing kind of takes care of itself to an extent. So, it's that initial phase where it's like if you get the head a little bit too big, then, you kind of then need to make the body, bigger and bigger and bigger to match the head, and then, your sort of feet go off the page or something like that. So it's kind of a matter of sort of being very careful at the beginning of one of these things to kind of get that basic perspective and proportion and that sort of stuff down, and then sort of following that, right? Regardless of whether that sort of matches my, sort of plan or not. So, that, again, as you see, some of that stuff sort of changes a little bit, but this is a very simple sort of pose, right? I'm not breaking any new ground, drawing a character that I'm very comfortable drawing. So, but yeah, just as an example of kind of, how I would sort of go about this. And if I was doing this on paper, it would be a very similar thing. It's just that underdrawing would be a very light pencil drawing, right? And, sometimes if I'm doing this in Photoshop, I will definitely be, drawing in the same way as if I was on paper. I don't do a separate sketch on a separate layer. I just kind of do a faint sort of sketch on the same layer. And that does give the drawing a little bit more energy, right? It all depends, sort of what there's no real reason to any of this. This is mostly me just kind of doodling around. I think I make her legs a little bit sort of too big to begin with, because part of her design is that she is kind of a bit sort of wafy and sort of skinny, which is, again, it's a purposeful part of the design. It's about her not necessarily being strong from working out or anything. She's kind of magically strong. That's sort of part of the character. Again, the character I created and sort of drew a whole comic book about. So again, just kind of like playing around, and again, things like sort of the, like the swords, or, drawing a little sort of, parts of the clothing. A lot of that is really about figuring out which bit do you draw first. How do I sort of start? And typically, if you get the sequence right, you sort of don't need to do as much construction because one thing leads from another. But you can always, one of the tricks I use is I make a new layer and I kind of draw a belt or something like that on it, and then I'll erase lines underneath that kind of overlap, and then I'll kind of merge them down. Do you know what I mean? That's a very kind of Photoshop specific sort of technique to use, but super effective for this kind of thing. Again, I'm going for a slightly more sort of like finished, clean drawing than maybe I normally would here. So yeah, basically it's very simple kind of like drawing sort of process, fairly direct drawing process, going for a clean line style. Things are fairly sketchy. And probably from a conceptual standpoint, we're going to focus on the head, which I'm just making a little bit bigger because I feel like it was just making her feel a bit sort of tall and stuff. But once the drawing's pretty much done, I'm just kind of tweaking and adding a couple more things before we start coloring. Just kind of beefing up a couple of lines here and there, and remembering to add the sword sort of sticking out the back. So that's the basic sort of coloring done. And now I'm gonna again use that trick where I'm using sort of selection tools. I'm going to quick mask and I start to kind of join up the bits because, the better you get the line drawing initially, the cleaner the line drawing is, the more enclosed it is, the easier this goes. But, this is a very quick way to kind of get that flat sort of overall pose done. And again, this is the same thing I use if I'm doing sort of comics or whatever. So again, the bulk of the sort of the process stuff is sort of done now. It's really just a matter of putting flat colors on. And sometimes I'll just kind of drag. Sometimes I might, if I've drawn this character before, I'll just sort of take those same colors and kind of have them in a file next to me and just kind of color pick colors I've used before. Or sometimes I reuse a background I've used before. Again, that stuff, none of that stuff's really important, right? It's just kind of it's just a color or some texture. So, reusing that stuff is sort of smart. But this one, I'm starting it all from scratch. So again, using that sort of graphic brush sort of look, and you can see that, again, being a bit messy with it is sort of part of the style, you know what I mean? I guess you could sort of say of this. And it's basically just sort of trying to indicate that, none of this is meant to be super detailed, do you know what I mean? So, and just being consistent with that. But I do feel like, just playing around with this a little bit gives us some sort of nice, happy accidents that I sort of enjoy a little bit more than, going through and sort of trying to get all of those lines exact. Because honestly, I could easily spend, a good 40 minutes, like well more than, the whole drawing time, just getting all of those little, especially if the drawing's a little bit tighter, getting all of those flattered sort of elements exactly right, perfectly platted so that every line is exactly right. It actually takes a lot of time. Do you know what I mean? It's very much, if you look at like the effectiveness of the image versus how much time that would take, it's not necessarily smart. But again, that's sort of what I mentioned about sort of trying to keep things loose on purpose so that none of it sort of looks, super messy, right? It's a sketch. It's still, it's not super finished, but it has consistency. So again, often, there's a couple of sort of subtleties I often like to do with these kind of flat things is just, changing, some of the, lips and ears and things like that. I find that, putting some more saturated colors here or there, or putting some details here and there in terms of just flat color. But, making the lips a little bit brighter, the nose a little bit brighter. I just find that things like, putting the fingernails in, right? It may seem like a small thing, but that can add a huge amount of just life to what is essentially a flat image. And often the way I think with sort of flat colors and that sort of stuff is really try and get the flat colors to a stage where you kind of feel like they're good enough, right? That you could sort of press print on it right there, that it's sort of, that the image has integrity. It's sort of doing all that it needs to. And then as I kind of add rendering, I'm sort of, how do I not mess this up? Do you know what I mean? How do I just kind of add a little bit to it? That's what I find is the most efficient way to kind of think about using this style where we are relying on sort of flat color. Try and get it looking as good as it can be before you move on to any rendering, right? Because I've always found that it never works very well to sort of say, oh, I'll fix this in the color, right? I'll sort of, when I'm rendering, it's not looking very good, but if I add shading to it, it'll look better. Like, I've often found that doesn't doesn't turn out too well. So that's something I'm always conscious of, is like, if it's not looking good with just the flat colors, then, it's probably important to kind of keep working at them a little bit. So again, just kind of, adding with this one, I'm adding a little bit, more rendering than I, did to some of the others. But, a part of that is because, it's a clean line sort of drawing, a little bit more clean. And, I just wanted to kind of play around and show that you can add more rendering, using this technique if you want. You could, for instance, add highlights as well. Do rendering. You could add rim light. You can do a lot more. But again, I like the simplicity. I found often I keep coming back to the simplicity and the niceness of just kind of that, animated style. Line of flat color is super effective and super clear. And yeah, I've just kind of I always come back to that, even if I, start to sort of render stuff up, start to paint, I always come back to just how much I like flat color and line. Yeah, but often, rendering does kind of help. It gives more sort of breadth, more sort of options to sort of tweak stuff as I go, gives me something to do at the end. Yeah, so again, just adding some sort of gradients and things like that. I find that a lot of these are just, they're very simple things I've found over the years that help bring the sort of clean line style, just give it a bit more sophistication, right? If I need it to not look quite so cartoony. And also I find this stuff really helps if I need to blend in a painted background with sort of line and color. Sort of characters, right? Being able to sort of tweak the lines and kind of blend them into the background a little bit helps a lot. Makes it feel less, like a little bit more like a painting. Okay, it sort of homogenizes the image a little bit. Makes it less like it's kind of, some character stuck on a background, right? So again, this is the kind of stuff I'll tweak, a fair bit towards the end. And it's mainly just because I can sort of sit back and sort of think about what I've done. And it's basically just, gives me a way to kind of look at the image, and sort of, just assess it. Is it working? Where's it not working? Sort of, change it. And, if it's really not working, I'll need to go back and, do a bit more rendering or play around with stuff some more. Again, doing a lot of this post-processing can help to really bring consistency to comic book pages, and also to help blend in, maybe a painted background or, a background that I've cut and pasted from somewhere else onto, the background here. Makes it feel like it's just one sort of cohesive image. So anyway, that's the basics for, how this sort of process goes. That's sort of what I'm doing. Hopefully you guys have enjoyed kind of watching this, and it's given you a couple of tips or things to think about. Anyway, thanks guys.